And tonight we have Bernie Herman, who will be speaking about these two somewhat, sort of not quite derelict houses on Wolfe Street.
Not quite. And we're actually here.
Oh. Anyway, the wonderful thing about these houses is that they, as Bernie will discuss, is that they represent a wider look at the economies that were happening in the late 18th century, and that these represent a more sort of expansive look at how industry and commerce were developing not only in America but in Europe. The whole, which talks about these houses not only in a more parochial sense in Fells Point, but in sort of a mid-Atlantic and sort of European sense of what's happening. So anyway, before we start the lecture, I'd like to just thank again our sponsors, Canusa Corporation, David H. Gleason Associates, Patrick Sutton, Shamoon Makowski and Dew Architects, and Terra Nova Ventures. And that on November 9th, Dr. Ira Berlin will be here to talk about Frederick Douglass and his experience growing up in Fells Point. So, Dr. Bernie Herman is the George B. Tillman Distinguished Professor of Southern Studies at Baltimore at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. He's an experienced author. His first books explore vernacular architecture through a succession of problems and interpretive perspectives that include historical cycles of building and rebuilding in the 18th and 19th century. Over the span of his career at the University of Delaware and at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, he has served on the faculty and departments of programs in American Studies, History, Art History, Folklore and Urban Affairs, and Public Policies, and co-founded two interdisciplinary collaborative research centers, one for historic architecture and engineering. His courses, large lectures, and compact seminars introduce students to images, things, and ideas that excite and inspire rich conversations and innovative explorations. His community engagements through public presentations, workshops, and other mechanisms derive from a deeply held belief that work of the arts and humanities finds its first calling in the public sphere. So I think that's a wonderful introduction to Bernie Herman. Bernie, thank you very much, and we look forward to you speaking.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all for having me up here. And I'd like to recognize David, who's been instrumental in getting me here, and of course my old colleague Peter in the back there, who has tried to keep me honest over the years and failed miserably, but you know, that's the breaks. I'd also like to begin by making it clear that I do not see myself as any kind of authority on Baltimore architecture. I've had the privilege to work in Baltimore on occasion, but I would leave that distinction to folks like Mary Ellen Hayward, who are really quite extraordinary in the depth and breadth of their research. Elaine F. work on painted screens is truly a landmark endeavor. And I'd like to recognize posthumously Orlando Rideout. The only reason that I had the opportunity to examine the Wolfe Street houses was because Orlando had the vision then that these were important buildings, and that the first step to grasping their importance resided in documentation, trying to figure out exactly what it was we are looking at. And that work has continued with very interesting findings over the years. But when we were done with that documentation, Orlando asked me the really tough question. He says, Bernie, these buildings are, in pretty rough shape. And then they were in rough shape. And he says, What percentage of original fabric would have to survive if we had to replace things in kind to keep these buildings up in their integrity first and foremost? And I said, they are so extraordinarily rare that I would argue that as little as 30% of the original fabric, as long as everything is documented and replaced in kind, would continue to tell the story of what are really a pair of the most remarkable 18th century survivals, not in Baltimore, not in the Mid-Atlantic, not in the Chesapeake, but in the North Atlantic Rim. These buildings are the rarest of the rare. They are the buildings that show up at the lowest possible valuation in the 1798 direct tax. They are buildings that were for poor artisans, for entry-level citizens of the city. They were the homes of free families of color. They tell us so much in terms of what that life was like and what that life could be like. If we would just take the time to preserve these buildings and to make sure they are there for the future. Imagine it this way. You go to the courthouse, you take down the earliest volume of records, you open it up, you read the first page, you rip it out, you burn it. We document these houses. If we don't save them, we might as well have destroyed that first page. Now, with that in mind, as in my comments tonight, is I really want to put these buildings in a framework to think about them. And so I want to introduce some ideas at the outset. The first of these is context. What is the context of these buildings? And you think about context here as embedded. How are these buildings embedded in histories of architecture, of urban life, of social relationships? The second thing here is the idea, a distinction I would like to draw between place and space. Place is best understood as the address. Space are all the practices that enliven that address, the lives that are lived there, how they play out. If you think about the National Register for Historic Places and you think about Criterion C, which is architectural, in many ways what it does is it reinforces a culture of property, a culture of real estate, often at the expense of social experience. That what we learn are chains of ownership, possibly of residency, but we really do not learn about how people occupy and live in these places. That seems to me, that idea of space, the enlivening of a location, of how people live in a space, is at the heart of what we might think of as ideologies of everyday life. Not ideology in the big capital I political sense, but as the systems and networks of values and beliefs that are often unarticulated, unstated, that unify people, that bring them together, and that also create distinctions between people. These buildings speak to that kind of ideology, and they do so because when we look at them, we engage what we might think of as an imaginary. We are able to, the thing that we see in space, linked to these places, linked to context, are these communities of sensibility, these communities of interest, of mutuality, and of distinction. All of this then brings us to a question of aesthetics. And we are so used to thinking of aesthetics as the philosophy of the beautiful, but there's a very different way to think about aesthetics. You can think about the aesthetics of these buildings as the balance and proportion of being in the world. How are these buildings in the world, and in the worlds that they have inhabited in excess of 200 years? So with that is that, just to give you a reminder of when we saw these buildings in the early 1980s and were asked to draw them, you see that they were constituted by a single room plan. They were compact buildings. They were single story with an unheated loft above them. But for all of that, they were lathed and plastered on the interiors. They were well finished. They had mantles. They were stock mantles. They were had a long and complicated history of how they may have appeared on the street, which could end up proving really quite revelatory. I'm very excited about the discoveries in that regard. But when you start to look at all the materials and all the elements in these buildings, is they were not without grace. They were not without gestures to a particular threshold of elegance. They were not without amenity. And it's a mistake to sort of think of these things as sort of structures that really sort of fall below a threshold of, say, polite society or of a kind of decorative sensibility. It's quite the opposite. And this is where how people lived in these buildings is really crucial. They were also not unique in Fells Point. There are or Baltimore. There are other timber frame buildings. Several of these recorded by the Historic American Building Survey through in the 1930s. And these buildings too often had mantles that were probably not made specifically for those buildings, but came from basically lumber yards or stock items that you could buy, not unlike going to Home Depot, but on a much, much smaller scale. And that as you saw these buildings also had a capacity to grow. That what started off often as a one-room house with a finished mantle. I know downstairs there's sort of an installation about cooking in those buildings. Kitchens were an addition to the Wolfe Street buildings. They were not there as part of the original fabric. There's exterior siding that is underneath those later kitchens that is actually still surviving in place today. It reminds us then is that we need to set aside our presuppositions about what urban life may have been like, even at the most basic level of cooking. There's an extraordinary Peel engraving from a failed series that was intended to be published in Philadelphia in the late 18th century. And they were definitely inspired by the engravings of William Hogarth. It's a scene of a young woman. It's actually a parable about domestic and feminine virtue, but it's a scene of a young woman carrying a pie in the street in a ceramic container with the verse, "The pie from bakehouse she has brought, and let it fall for want of thought, and all the sweeps collect around the pie that's scattered on the ground." What you see there is that in that between the lines is in that idea of the everyday, is that these buildings also existed in a culture of takeout, and that people would buy provisions. They would provision off premises. They didn't necessarily cook in their houses. So you want to think about how these things would have factored in, and also where they stand in a larger context in Baltimore of the brick row house, of its origins, of its variations. And again, I commend you to the work of Mary Ellen Hayward for that. So let's start with these little buildings in our brief time together this evening and sort of walk through several contexts. If they are embedded text, if they are lodged within larger architectural and social histories, within larger stories of human experience, then what is that matrix? What is it that they are enlarged in? Or that they are lodged in? So if we begin with these, the first thing to think about is, are there other cities? Are there other places where we find smaller houses of this sort? What do those houses look like? They are exceptional, the Wolfe Street houses, as survivals. They are truly exceptional in that regard. But how exceptional are they in terms of, say, late 18th century aspirational culture? How exceptional are they within the universe of artisans who are constantly finding ways to move forward in the early American city and in European cities. So if we were to look at a place like Drinkers Court in Philadelphia, we see that these small houses were a regular amenity, that they were more often than not rental properties. They were let out to others. And this is why space, that idea of space, of the enlivening of that address is so crucial. Is if we deal with these exclusively as artifacts, as physical relics, and lose sight of how people lived in these, then we really lose sight of the human factor that's at play in all of these structures. We see that in buildings like Drinkers Court, also recorded by the Historic American Building Survey, we see here that there are buildings that have stock finishes that are really quite sophisticated. Fully paneled end walls, first floor and in this case second floor. Roughly finished garrets, sometimes with little fireplaces, as you see here, more often not. We see that wherever we are in any of these cities as we go further this evening, is that this level of amenity in small houses is not the exception, but rather the rule. That this is what these small houses were like. So when we talk about the rise of tenements as we understand them now, we really are talking about something that's much more specific to the 19th century, to the rise of the industrial city. In the merchant city, the mercantile city, the cities of Atlantic trade, we are looking at something that is slightly different. There's no question that there were tenements, but a tenement, the legal definition of a tenement is a place that's rented. That's what it comes down to. And it's rented without necessarily any kind of stain of social identity. That's just how it was. The question is, you get down is, how many people are actually in renting these houses? And what we found in places like Baltimore, when we looked at tax lists, the 1798 federal direct tax, which is property, cross-referenced and linked, thank goodness for the digital revolution, to local tax lists, is what we generally find is that there are twice the number of surnames as there are physical addresses. Very often there are more than that. There are some streets where there will be as many as 4 surnames per address, depending on what the house is like. So that you want to think again about what those lives are, and that gets you to part of this idea of these ideologies, these networks of values and beliefs, is how people pass in and out of these houses, how they interact with each other. Is that then it's not a box of possessions, it's a box, a container, a porous box, a porous container, where people are constantly moving in and out of each other's vision, out of each other's sensibility. The other thing is you want to think about the array of senses that come into play, especially with a place like the Wolfe Street houses, is the partition walls between the two are roughly, with the lath and plaster, about 2 inches thick, as I recall. Just enough so that you could reenact the interaction of Pyramus and Thisbe from a Midsummer's Night Dream. And if somebody had gastric distress in one address, you certainly heard it in the other, and very often would have engaged in a kind of malodorous moment. Not to put a fine point on it, is that what this raises, though, is the question of etiquette. Is the rules of etiquette. Now, and what is privacy? Privacy is not a partition anymore. It is how you choose, or how you were schooled, or how you see and don't see as you occupy these kinds of places. Even when they're on a grander scale, for example, 2 rooms on a floor and 2 stories tall, as you see here on Lawrence Street in Philadelphia. In these buildings, whether they are in Philadelphia, whether they are in the United Kingdom, is that what you find is that these kinds of rules, these kinds of interplays have a broad international currency. that is defined as much by station as anything else, station and habit. So that as you look at these, you also, which one of these is from Philadelphia, I'll leave it up to you to figure out. Which one of these is from the seaport town of, I believe it's a suburb of London, Deptford is the other, I'll leave it to you to tell me which one is which one is American, which one is English. Because the point is that these houses exist within that kind of global conversation. It's not just about the exchange of bookish ideas amongst elites. It is the exchange of ideas, the flow of information across all strata of society. How many captains are on a ship? How many crew members? Aren't they all going toing and froing from pretty much the same starting and ending points? So what we sort of conveniently leave out is all those other and actually demographically much larger interactions in the telling of the story of the Atlantic world. So there are a couple things I want to get here in terms of these contexts as I move forward, and I'll be as brief as I can here. First of all is the idea of a general style of houses. This is a copy from a travel journal of a Charlestonian moving from South Carolina up to look at the Moravians. He wanted to go see Moravians in the 18th century. Why not? On his way, he stops in Philadelphia, and he produces this remarkable sketch, made more remarkable for the idea of the general style of houses in Philadelphia. Because what he tells us as a Charlestonian is that every place has its general style of houses. This raises, how many of y'all are familiar with Doctor Who? Does anybody here ever watch Doctor Who beside me? All right, okay. There's his craft is a TARDIS, which is the size of a London phone box. And the distinguishing thing is that when you go inside, it is much bigger than it is on the outside. Think about these houses as being conceptually much larger on the inside than they are on the outside. Not physically, but in terms of the worlds that they evoke. So that we find that as part of this idea of context of embeddedness is speculative rows. Is, if anything, is the Wolfe Street houses are spec houses, that they are built as part of a row of several, I believe it was seven or six as it was originally put together. That's not unusual. That's how cities were growing in this time period. Developers, somebody would own a large tract of land, they would subdivide it. Builders usually would buy up a set of lots, subdivide that, build on that in multiple units, usually inhabit one of those units for some period of time before selling off and selling all the others, and the city kept advancing along these kinds of developments. Sometimes they were not resident, but that's what they would do. They would subdivide and then build on these lots. And there actually is some evidence for that. There are certainly plat books. But here are the drawings of William Palmer from Philadelphia, which shows all these variations of exactly the same thing. Notice that in these drawings, there are no dimensions. And it's because they are ideas. They are not elevations and plans. They are ideas for the growth or for the expansion of houses. Only when he's doing purpose-built commissions do you begin to see scale bars in his drawings from this time period. We also know that there was standardization, as there was price fixing, often seen in carpenters' rule books, that the ones for Philadelphia survived, but they were common in other cities as well. And also standardization in the language of insurance policies, which were generally written by folks who were very knowledgeable in the building trades and how those things would work out. We also see is that the Wolfe Street houses in this world of spec housing around the Atlantic world are one alternative. In Philadelphia and in Alexandria, Virginia, one of the alternatives was you would build the kitchens set back from the front of the lots, and then people would come along and then contract or purpose build the front of the house. But it's like putting in all the utilities and then you build the house on the in front of that and connect it. And this is what happened throughout parts of Philadelphia and Alexandria. Also, you see that folks begin to fill in behind deeper lots with rows of single-room tenements that were often divided up into multiple flats per floor. And then there are these. And it's a mistake to associate the Wolfe Street houses with this kind of urban building, things that are really just sort of put together, thrown together at the back of a lot. Whatever their condition is now, those Wolfe Street houses have stood for almost 2¼ centuries. That is not a characteristic of something that is tossed up and not intended to survive, to have some sort of commodity life projected into the future. The other thing about these buildings, and my examples will shift from Philadelphia in a minute, is that you have this uniform row at one point. And if you go down there now, it's like the smile of the wife of Bath. Gap-toothed she was. And what you see is that you've got 2 units, and there's some brick infill where other units were removed, and then there's another one further up the street. And that these have uneven development histories. In a place like Baltimore, in a place like Charleston, South Carolina, Savannah, Georgia, Bristol, England, is that there's an emphasis on unity or uniformity at the street, on regularity, that falls apart about 9 inches into the story. As people begin to, make changes to their houses, modify them, so that when you see a place like Philadelphia here, is that in Elfreth's Alley, is that you start to get into these houses and there are all these variations, back-to-back tenements such as this. Houses that use piazzas, those little indented areas in the middle, and piazza is the Philadelphia term for that. What happens behind these houses is important. Much of that evidence is gone now, but they have these very uneven histories at the back of the lot, where people are constantly reinventing service, domestic workspaces, kitchens, washrooms, carving out over periods of times, things like an additional chamber or a rental space within one of these buildings. So that as you look at Baltimore, as you look at Fells Point, you want to think about the illusion of uniformity in a world that is defined by extraordinary variation. And then you have to ask yourself is, why? Why is there that emphasis on uniformity of the street, on the regularity of the brick row? A regularity that's described in the 18th century in any number of cities as visually boring, as something that is just a drag on the psyche. They don't use psyche. I know that that's not invented for another century or so. But this idea of sort of this dullness, which is a word that they would have used at the street. What is the ideology of regularity? Why is that important at the public face? And why is it unimportant in the private sphere? How do those two things begin to interact? How do they come together so that you end up with a city that accommodates houses like this at the same time and living experiences that somehow align and diverge around both difference and also continuity? as you think about these places and how they flow together, how they work out, it's important to look at other cities, to think about places around the Atlantic world at the time the Wolfe Street houses are being built. For example, Linskill Square in Whitby, England. Now, I know that everybody knows that Whitby is where Dracula makes his first landfall in Bram Stoker's novel. I mean, everybody knows that. At least everybody in this room now knows that. Did you know that it was number 6 in terms of ship registrations in the 18th century in the United Kingdom? Ship registrations. Who builds ships? Shipwrights. Who builds ships in Baltimore? Shipwrights. Are these ships, do ships need repairs as they go from place to place? Yes, they do. Have you ever thought about staterooms on larger ships in the 18th century that are paneled interiors, parlors that are on the sea, and that people, captains and company, entertain in those kinds of spaces, and that it might be that ship parlors are as much, or staterooms are as much an agent of architectural exchange as are pattern books? How much of that world exists within the world of practice and of memory? So that we see houses that are exactly the same footprint. Houses that admit the lives of caulkers, sailmakers, shipwrights, riggers. We see that these houses, whether they are in the London suburb of Deptford on the, this is the part that always kills me, is on the far side, or in the Trinity area of Frome, which has nothing to do with the sea and everything to do with the manufacture of textiles, hand manufacture of textiles in the 18th century English hinterland. Artisans all. Is there a larger artisan sensibility that is in play, that is embodied in the Wolfe Street houses? And that we see that when we are in the London suburbs, you have to move away from Mayfair, you have to move away from central London. You know, great, go to Russell Square, have a good time, forget about it. You need to get yourself out to places like Deptford. You need to get yourself in the back streets of Greenwich. You need to go out beyond Whitechapel now, out up to Kingsland Road, up into these older kinds of communities, which are a very different kind of London. They are not Summerson's London. They are the London of the people who would have been able to sit down with the folks on Wolfe Street and share conversation and sensibility. What were the insides of their houses like? You know, we really forget this. You know, we say, okay, we'll put some furniture in there. And then we invariably put in something that's sort of low end. My favorite houses, having read inventories for these Deptford houses, are the ones that are filled with birds. Is that there are all kinds of exotica. They would have coconut cups or ostrich shell cups. They would have things such as parakeets or canaries that they brought with them. Is that these were places that were also pineapples, supercargo. These were places where people had access to this kind of these kinds of goods, not on the grand scale, but in ways that are very different and in ways that they make their very own. They are the same sorts of houses that populate the back streets of Hull, on the Humber River. This one neatly sectioned by a German bomb in the 1940s. Don't try this at home. But to give you that idea, it's 3 stories, sure, but it's the same idea in terms of space. How many people live in here? You can see the back alleys from Hull in this rather extraordinary drawing done for slum clearances in the late 19th century. And how old are these practices? You know, is this something that just shows up? Think about London itself. Think about the Wall of London. Think about companies like the Cheesemongers or the Corporation of London, which managed rental properties of all sorts, and they would begin to build houses, among others. My favorite one in one of the remaining turrets of the Wall of London. You just stick a chimney in there and try and punch a window in somewhere. Same houses. Now we're talking Leadenhall Street. Now we're talking down in parts of the city that we associate as the wealthiest parts of the city in the 18th century, which are a jumble of all these different kinds of plans and footprints. So that as we look at these things, we begin to see that our Wolfe Street houses are really operating within this kind of global conversation, this North Atlantic world conversation, which is powerfully inflected in ways that are beyond simply hemispheric. You have to think about the way in which African traditions, African lives play out here. You have to think about Europe not as a monolithic place, but Europe is a place with many nations. You have to think about the polyglot that is Fell's Point in the 18th century. You have to think about the fact that there will be commodities from South Asia, from China, from Indonesia on those tables in those houses at every level of society. These are truly worldly people. These are the poor caulkers, these are the wealthy merchants, and we are all their poorer successors. Our view of the world is much narrower than theirs was. So as you look at these houses, now you begin to think, I hope, about these houses in a kind of balance and proportion of being in the world in the most literal sense of world, of how these things operate in that larger space. Houses that on the face of it, by our values, seem small, cramped, but are truly expansive, truly part of imaginaries that are linked by networks that we don't even remember, but that we can still find, whether they are link us to Philadelphia or to places like Lancaster, the general style of buildings in this place. It turns out is that Lancaster townhouses in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, are those follow an arrangement which resonates with the three-room Flurkuchenhäuser of the Pennsylvania backcountry, but also turn out to be the houses that are part of German cities that you find recorded in the many volumes of the urban vernacular houses of Germany. We see that every city had its artisans' houses. Some artisans were wealthier than others, but certainly there were artisans at work in places like Charleston, South Carolina, Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And here is where I want to come down to another thing, is that we really need to do the work on space, how people lived in these houses. This looks like a pretty large house from the face of it. Turns out that if a husband died and left a widow and orphans, you didn't have to lose both parents to be an orphan, you just had to lose your father and then you were an orphan. But the rule of thirds kicked in, and that widows had a life right to a portion of the house, and that the courts would come in and survey their portion of the house and then describe it in legal documents. And so that if you go find the buildings, take the legal documents, and spend the time, as you can begin to see that this is a house that is really in three sections. The children's section, which is really a rental property to ensure income, to ensure their financial well-being as they come of age, the widow's life right, and then the shared areas. And the most fascinating areas in these houses, I think, are these shared areas. How many people share the spaces of Wolfe Street? I don't know, but it's a question that is truly worth finding out. It's also worth remembering is that even when the size of the house doesn't change, is people find ways to insert more and more walls. They find ways to take a house as a single room in plan, such as Wadden Court on the far side, take apart the chimney and reposition everything in order to create a house of multiple spaces. Same footprint. You would think that the Wolfe Street houses would not admit subdivision. But it's a question that is worth asking. You want to think here about the extent to which people would remodel, rework, alter, make these places spaces, make them their own. And as we move to this idea of the general style of houses in Philadelphia, as I begin to wrap this up, is I want you to think in ways that are not necessarily about the general style of just buildings, but the general style of being in urban landscapes. And so I choose 3 iconic Baltimore objects. And I want you to think about how these things actually intersect. The Baltimore album quilt. Baltimore album quilts, they have a tremendous rise in the antebellum period. Really 1840s is when they spike. But they exist within a much larger tradition. The earliest quilts are in fact not made from scraps. The earliest quilts were status items. The ones that survive from the 1600s are whole cloth quilts of fine fabrics, some embroidered or quilted with images of sailing ships on them. They are Portuguese. They come out of South Asia, a tradition in South Asia where they are used as floor coverings. That these kinds of quilts are not some sort of apotheosis of the poor, but rather a perfection of a much larger image of artistic production. Think about then, how does that kind of art possibly resonate with the Wolfe Street houses? Or think about more recently the painted window screens, the work of Johnny Eck here, who is a screen painter, also star of the one of the stranger movies ever made. Was it Todd Browning's Freaks? I forget the date. Is that 39? Something like that. It's late 30s. But you think about the idea of painting screens and what that means in terms of not being able to look in, but being able to look out. What does it mean in the city of regularity when you block, these things, when you use a very different device, but to basically block the gaze in a one-directional flow? Is this without context? Is this sort of a one-off thing, or does it exist within a larger arc of conversations that go over not just decades, not just generations, but really over big chunks of centuries? And then I had a call or a series of emails about the crab cake. Now, I'm not being silly here. I want you to think about a crab cake. Does everybody here, at least know what a crab cake is? All right. And everybody here is aware that it is the Baltimore crab cake. It is. And that they arise by that name in the 1880s. What is the origin of the crab cake? Have you ever thought about that? Where does it come from? This thing that has now sort of moved into the world of gentrification of politeness, just as Fells Point has moved into the world of gentrification and politeness. A crab cake is essentially a fritter. That's what it is, a fritter that is molded and fried. That is where the fritters come from. There are 2 big fritter arcs. I know you weren't expecting this, but it's important because you need to think about that place and space difference around those Wolfe Street houses. The fritter, on the one hand, the ones that we think of as like being more like pancake-like, that's Northern European. Those are really coming out of the Netherlands for part and these are pretty early on. The other fritter is one that is thicker, is often denser, and it comes out of an African tradition. All those chefs, that crab cake that arises out of the crab fritter is the African American past of Baltimore that we pursue with extraordinary avidity and consume with even more extraordinary lack of awareness. You want to think then about the Wolfe Street houses as a place where there may have been quilts and what those quilts would have looked like. You want to think about it as a place that people could look out as well as in. You want to think about the porosity of those houses. You want to think about the smells that come from something that may be frying. You want to think about foodways, about what people were eating, about fritters, which were a way, like chowders of various sorts, of creating the equitable distribution of food or sustenance within a household. That you want to begin to think about these things as systemically linked. You want to think about them in terms of those ideologies, those imaginaries, and ultimately you want to think about these houses within contexts of global associations and powerful, powerful local significances. Thank you all very much.
Questions?
That depends on how hard they are.
Oh, well, questions then?
Sure, go ahead.
So you say this row of houses and the regularity is not dull, it is what? I didn't quite grasp where you were
Is that
taking
there's this question about regularity. And I mean, people like Webster talking about Philadelphia talk about the dull regularity of the streets of Philadelphia. That is really a perspective. There are other ways, if your eye is attuned to variation, to nuance, to neighbors, where that regularity would be something that is not apparent. That in fact, that there is the extraordinary opportunity for individual expression within these buildings. Not in terms of a modern notion of individuality, but rather just within the course of how people occupy and shape spaces of their own. So that my argument here is not that there is not regularity, but rather that it is an idea that is deeply nuanced, and that when we talk about regularity, we are also talking about variation. Every time we bring up one of these characterizing terms, these categorizing terms, is we need to think about what its opposite is and how it actually plays. If there's regularity as opposed to what? It's a value. It's not an absolute. So that's why I bring this forth.
Why do you not address the issue of the developer viewpoint? Efficiency in construction is to make 6 of them at a time.
That would be I mean, it's a very good point. It's also a reading of the building in a purely commodified sense. It then exists entirely within a network of economic exchange as opposed to social and cultural exchange. Once those, and they only live that, those buildings only exist that way for a brief period of time. As soon as somebody moves in, is that, you know, whatever the developer wants. I mean, how many of y'all, you know, dealt with, if any of y'all have ever been the landlord, I've never been a landlord, and you have dealt with tenants, you will find that they will find a way to make their mark on these places, for good or, you know, for better or for worse. So yes, it's expeditious to build in this way. There's a real economic imperative to build in this way and sort of build and move on. As soon as they are built, though, is then, you know, everything's up for grabs. One way to think about it is they are in a constant state of negotiation. Okay. Actually, and I'm glad you asked the question because years and years and years ago, gosh, when I was younger, and there was actually about 50% of me, is that I was asked to write a piece for Preservation Forum on fleeting landscapes, and it was about this question of dealing with buildings as objects and not and sort of setting experience aside, which led to me giving a lecture at the National Register of Historic Places that I entitled, much to their dismay, but I stand by it, Criterion C-. Because what Criterion C is architecture. It's the commodified, it's the property idea of architecture as opposed to the experiential side of architecture. I hope that was reasonably satisfying, but hopelessly vague. Yes?
Your presentation is interesting because it really talks about the problem that I run into all the time with buildings is that people think that there is a way to preserve a building, that you go through and you go trash, 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 this is old, this is historic, we're going to save this and highlight it. And I go into buildings like the Cocker's houses, I have to remember which name it is now, the Cocker's houses.
Wolfe Street houses.
Wolfe Street houses, and everything you look at was put there by somebody and was interacted by somebody, and even the foundations that are still in the backyard, and each one has a story to tell, and people don't want to, they don't have the imagination to know there's even a story there. And so people want to see these things be improved, and the question is to what? You know, I've had projects where people say, we want our windows restored. Well, what do you mean? Well, you're the one who does it, you ought to know. Well, I can restore them 50 different ways. What are your criteria? And so, I mean, these buildings are a shredded book waiting for somebody to put all the pieces back together so a decision can be made about what's the important part of their history. You know, did Frederick Douglass walk through there or not?
I agree, and what we really tend to lose sight of the humanity of these things, and yet to me, that's why I do the work I do. One of the great pleasures for me is if you have the opportunity to pick up a hand-thrown piece of ceramics, is you can feel the finger marks of the potter. There is a direct kind of touch there. And that's sort of overstated and romantic, I know, but you know there is that. And so, how do we reach out and find all these all these different dimensions? You know, no object tells one story. That's it. You know, and so what preservation often does is it becomes a kind of rhetoric. It becomes an act of persuasion along something that is, at its very core, political. So when you start to think about preservation in those terms, or restoration, or renovation, or home remodeling, or whatever you're doing, or anybody's doing, like those people on television on House and Garden are always flipping houses, and I always like the style of things they make for other people, you know, and other people are so enthusiastic. Is that, you know, every time they do that, they're presenting a rhetorical position, and that's what we do. You can't tell every story. You're always going to sort of tell the story you need to tell in the moment. But what you can do is make sure that the wherewithal is somehow always there to tell the story that needs to be told, whatever that story is in that particular moment. That's a balancing act. I'm not saying it's easy, but that's how it is. Yes, go ahead.
I'm seeing that in the 40s and 50s, it says the homes were rented by some guys who were working with the Black Hawker Association around Baltimore City. Any idea what they would have been paying in rent?
That's a question for Baltimore experts, and I am not that. You know, what they would have paid in rent, or even, you know, who paid what percentage of rent, who was there. You know, I don't
Yeah,
know
through
who they were
those
paying
loans.
rent to. Were they subleasing? Who, God only knows. Trying to find, actually there's a wonderful book by Betsy Blackmar called Manhattan for Rent. It's an older book, but in which she talks about the entire problem of renting and all the strategies that people went into to developing rental housing and also about living in them. So that's where I would send you to sort of figure out not the dollar amount, the adjusted dollar amount, but just to even figure out the
Whole process.
strategy.
Because it looks like at first they were kind of owned by the family. They were owned at first by Anne Bond, and she was renting them, but she didn't live in them, yeah?
You'll have to talk to the Fells Point experiment.
Yeah, so she was the landlord, but then out of, in the 30s, they fell into somebody else's hands. It doesn't say, it just says they were renters.
You're talking about 1830s?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
What's the condition of these houses right now?
Honestly, rough.
So that you've been looking at this a long time, nobody's come to their rescue?
There have been lots of folks who've really working hard to find a way to rescue these houses, and they need to be rescued. There's no question of that. But the status of these houses and their future is really something that I would leave to David.
Just to bring you up to date, the houses have been owned by the Preservation Society since about 2008. I believe they were
2005.
2005. And currently, the society is looking for ways to reinvent them, to reconstruct them, and to give them a purpose in the community. It makes little sense to restore them without a purpose. These houses always had a purpose. They always worked within the community. Society they're working with the Friends of the Wolfe Street houses to develop a program where these houses can be, as I said, can be reconstructed and reinvented. What that program is has not been developed. But that is the ultimate goal, is to come up with some use for these houses and for the reconstruction and reinvention. It's a very difficult situation of the very small houses, and what exactly their use in the community will be has yet to be determined. So that is sort of the status of it. The houses are being maintained, the roof is being kept on the houses, there's maintenance being done on them to keep them in place. But there needs to be a larger picture, a larger idea about what these houses can be in the future. So if you have any ideas or thoughts, please contact the Preservation Society, because we're always, we are seeking community input to what these houses can be, right?
Just so that everybody here is aware that these houses have actively been stabilized over a period of time. Starting in 2004, since 2 years ago, there was monies that were becoming available and things would be done to stabilize the houses. All of it is out of your view. There's nothing there that you walk by and go, oh, look, fresh paint and new flower bed. There's nothing that you see. It's all inside. It's all doing the real basic structural. We're saving these things for the future. What David was talking about is that there have been a proposal of what to do with the buildings, but for it to be done without the community's involvement, without the friends of the Wolfe Street houses or the Caucus houses being part of that effort, then you're not really sure what you end up with. Preservation that isn't based in the community is an academic process, and it'll fail. You'll have money that you have to keep putting into it if it doesn't have local support.
This has to come from the community, has to come from without. The Preservation Society are the stewards of these houses at this time. And what the society wants to do is to provide a program, funding, and a sort of a long-term program for these houses, not just for today, but for 50 years from now. That is the goal of the society. So it's not just let's go in and let's paint them up and fix them up. That's not the idea. It's a much more long-term and more thoughtful process that is that's happening at this moment. So again, if you want to be involved, if you have ideas, thoughts, please contact the society and we'll talk about it, because this is the only way we can move forward with redeveloping these houses. They represent 225 years worth of Baltimore's history. And tonight, as Bernie says, they represent not only history at Fells Point, but they reflect the history of the Mid-Atlantic region and the Atlantic Rim. The thoughts that are in these houses were also in the thoughts of houses in England, in Amsterdam. I mean, these houses were not isolated. They were not a moment where only they happened in Fells Point, but they were a continuation of a whole development of ideas. So these houses, there are two left, and they represent a whole thought pattern of the 18th century, how people should live, and what should happen in a growing economic economy. And I think Bernie tonight has made a wonderful presentation about these houses were occupied by humanity, and they were not just houses, but they were part of families, of what happened, of sights and sounds, and they represent more than just the architecture of it. So that is why they're so valuable here. So again, if you have thoughts, if you have ideas, please present them to the Preservation Society, because it's going to take a lot of people to move this whole idea forward.
Question for you. I mean, in dealing with these houses, found some things that could very well represent beliefs of previous occupants. And one of them was on the building on the right, the image there, is 614. The floor had to come up to do work, and taking the floor up carefully, right in front of the hearth, on top of the soil was a pile of oyster shells, not burned, a pile of oyster shells, not in the dirt, not covered by dirt, that was, let's say, 18 to 24 inches long, 10 to 12 inches wide, and a good 4 inches deep. And I believe that that was a statement made by the occupants of the house. How they got under there is part of what would be great to discover, but that was a statement of, I'm assuming, good luck as far as the bounty of food in the house. There's all these charms that were brought over and by the African face that then became different things in these houses, and I think we have examples of that in these houses. Have you run into that sort of documentation of
Well, the best documentation of that is the work that was done by Ann Yench and Mark Leone in Annapolis, where they actually found crystals and other threshold items that had been interred in different parts of the house. I'd have to see the evidence on this, but the most important thing there is that is to keep an open mind in the face of the most seemingly ordinary of things. Gosh, poor Wallace Stevens, but let B be the finale of seeing. That's the idea, is that is that there isn't a finality to interpretation or to possibility. What you have is a real responsibility to creating the opportunity for voice wherever voice can be heard. And so it can be in the most ordinary of things, and it can be in the most exceptional of things.
Bernie, I'll just wrap it up. Thank you very much for, very the preservation beyond just what we see on the surface, but sort of what's sort of intrinsic in the building themselves. Thank you very much.